Okay, I think we're ready to get started. My name is Bill Murphy, and this is my wife, Patty. And we both have a background in seminary education. That's where we spend most of our time as a theologian and as a philosopher. And so we are very excited about our new Holy Father. And so we've been trying to learn about him. And as we're trying to get familiar with him and learn about him, we thought we'd take the opportunity to share that with anybody here who's interested. And so we entitled our talk, Getting to Know Pope Leo. A big part of it's going to be focused on his background. And then after that, we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges that he faces as he takes over the leadership of the church. And then some of the emphases he's given as to what his priorities are going to be. And then just a word about some of the hopes that might come out of that. So that the main part is on covering who he is, what his background is, and then those other topics are kind of overlapping. And it was just an attempt to organize things. So Patty's going to start out talking about his background, and we'll go back and forth a little bit on that. So glad to have you here. And we've got some PowerPoint slides that we're also going to be showing it's mostly just pictures of Leo at different points in his life. So if Michael could do that, this is a little bit of an experiment if we can be controlling from both up front here and in the back. There we go. Okay. So getting to know Pope Leo. Okay, so I'll turn it over to Patty now, and she'll start talking about Pope Leo's background. So where does he come from? Who is he?
I'm going to focus much more on his own life with his parents in Chicago. When it comes to the ancestry of Pope Leo, it's all over the place. Okay? So, the biggest news is Prevost seems to be an invented name. Okay. In other words, somewhere between Louisiana and Chicago, his Italian grandfather, which his name is Riquitano, changed the name to Prevost. So I leave it open to speculation if it was because, Italian was better in Chicago than Prevost, which is the French name, or whatever. But he did change the name. There's so far no explanation. I guess the Holy Father at some point may tell us what his family thinks. So that's one side. There is an Italian origin. Then there is the famous Creole/French connection. And of course, some people say, oh, he has African-American ancestry. That per se, I guess, is coming out of the Creole because on the Prevost is the father's side. On the mother's side, her name is Mildred Martinez. And they essentially say he comes initially from Puerto Rico. However, at some point, the Martinez met a French chick. That's the Creole connection. So they jumped from Puerto Rico into Louisiana and then later to Chicago. On a personal note, I dug into the Martinez saying, where did they come from? And you may have heard Haiti. Well, allow me to be for once a patriotic Spaniard. He comes from Spain, i.e. back in the day in the 19th century, La Española, which is the whole island of Haiti, got, split between France and Spain. That's why you have Haiti, French, Dominican Republic, Spanish. And the Spanish sent colonizers to patrol the border. So the Martinez initially come from the Canary Islands, what happens to be where I come from, which is a region in Spain where they, a lot of ancestry from Puerto Ricans and Cubans are from my island. So I guess islanders like to go to other islands. So that's if you want, Spanish/Puerto Rican Haiti connection. And, but leaving that aside, I want to land in Chicago. So you have the mother, which has been more said about the mother. The New York Times, for example, Mother's Day had a very nice article just about her. obviously very devout family. And the interesting thing about her, I thought, was that for her age, we're talking now the 40s in Chicago, she went to school. She graduated and had first a bachelor's in library science, and a bachelor in education. And the father, Mr. Prevost, was around that same time getting also a degree, master's in education from DePaul. So I conjecture, because they never tell you where they meet, and I guess they were at the same time, because the other interesting thing about her, for her age, in that time to have a bachelor's degree from college is very unusual. And we're talking of 45 to 49 when they studied. And the other unusual thing is she was getting married late in her 30s. And she had the 3 boys. And you may have seen the brothers. One is more quiet, like his brother, the Pope. One is more chatty. Okay. And the atmosphere in the house was essentially of father and mother being very involved in the parish life. The mother learning from the grandmother, who was already in Chicago. They were both very involved in community activities like leading daily the rosary. The father of Pope Leo was a very quiet man. He studied to be a teacher. He went to World War II, Normandy, and then the Dragon. My uncle probably knows the Dragon operation in southern France. And when he came back, I guess he had the GI Bill and got a degree. Taught initially in the elementary school, where probably Bob, at this point he's only Bob, had gone. And then he moved up the ladder to become even the superintendent of a specific region in Chicago. But he was a catechist. So he saw essentially the mother very involved in catechism and helping out in libraries, and the father also having time to be involved in the parish. So it was a family endeavor because all 3 kids had to be involved. And you may have heard the anecdote of the brother saying, odd enough, on the iron table, he started faking mass. We wanted to play with cars and trucks, and there he was pretending to be a priest. And he essentially obliged us to attend mass with him. Okay? So in closing, I'm going to say, essentially the quietness is very present in the father, because you can see his reserve like his dad, and the dedication and the fervor to live the life of the parish comes very much also from the mother. And at one point, I guess the mother realized he had a vocation, and he decided, and it was rough for the family, to be paying a boarding school, all the Augustinian, which was essentially seminary high school in Michigan. So it was hard for the mother, an early departure of the youngest son at 14 to go to Michigan. That's when he officially enters the Augustinian order. Those are the 3. And
you jumped a few steps for me, so I didn't get to advance the...
Yeah, and that's the mother. Some Chicago friends of mine will realize that's the stairs of Holy Name Cathedral. She was also a famous singer, so supposedly you can see that the Pope knows how to sing. It comes very much from the mother, who loves singing. So, there. And that's him already in Villanova, so it's your turn with the Augustinians.
Okay, I wanted to add one little anecdote that from his youth. So one of the ladies across the street, I mean, what kind of a young boy would it be that the lady across the devout Catholic woman across the street says, you're going to be the first American Pope someday? That
he was the wunderkind, so all the mothers envied Mildred, which is the name of the mother, saying, oh, we wish our boys would be like him.
So his parents reflected a very vibrant Catholic church in Chicago in these decades from, say, 1940 to 1965 or so. There's a book about this confident church, it's called. It's by a historian who's looking at Chicago Catholicism at that time. And it's really amazing to see how vibrant the church was. So, and it was one area in the country where the Irish didn't dominate the clergy, and that there were and also the population, and that had a salutary effect because you had big immigrant communities from all different countries, and the clergy in Chicago had to deal with this, and so they became very broad-minded and said, well, oh, because there would be some people who were just into Marian devotion, and they'd be praying the rosary all the time, and that was pretty much their thing. You had other people who were listening to the radio priest Charles Coughlin, who was a rabid kind of populist style. There was a lot of supporters of Joe McCarthy, the anti-communists. So you had people all across the map, and you also had some people who were very interested in justice for laborers. And so you had people who were focused on labor union justice. And then after the Second World War, you had some of the leading thinkers who were trying to work for justice for African Americans. And so you had all this going on in the church in Chicago, and it made the clergy, it made them very diverse and very tolerant of each other. And you also had this was a time in the church also where Pope Leo XIII, one of the things he's known for, besides something we'll mention later, which is his focus on Catholic social teaching, Leo XIII had also encouraged a recovery of Catholic intellectual life by recovering the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. And, that was, we were now about 4 to 5 decades into that, and it was bearing a lot of fruit. And so people were studying what they call a Thomistic philosophy in a lot of the institutions there. And this gives you a framework to be able to interact with all different kinds of thought, with economics, with psychology, with sociology, with ethics, with law. And so these people thought that they had, a way to engage intellectually with the whole culture. And so that made them very confident also. Like when the people are trying to figure out what made, Chicago Catholicism so unique, those are the two things they point to. It was a combination of, you had a strong intellectual culture that people were learning, plus you had this like diversity and toleration of difference, and you had a little bit of everything going on. And so what grew out of this?
You want to mention the groups?
Yeah. So the church in Rome had encouraged something they called Catholic action in the early 20th century. And the fruits of Catholic action, a bunch of things came out of it. Like you had very active labor union, because a lot of the Catholic population were working in industrial production. And so, they were struggling for, decent working hours and decent wages and all that. So you had all kinds of groups that spun up. So you had a Catholic labor movement. You had the Catholic youth organization, and in Chicago, they had, boxing leagues. The priests were trying to figure out how to keep kids from getting into trouble. So they had boxing all the parishes across Chicago, and they had basketball, and they had all kinds of things. You had the labor, you had the youth activities, you had young Catholic workers, young working people. They called it the Christian family movement. So it was young married couples, and it was very vibrant, and everybody was involved in these things. And they also integrated it into the education system. Like at the seminary, they had, there was something they called the liturgical movement, where people were paying a lot of attention to liturgy. And so the liturgical movement was also orienting worship towards living out justice and charity in the world. And so it was also in the seminaries. So it made what they called a very confident church. People were confident in their Catholic identity, and lay people were very engaged. And that actually prefigured a lot of what the Second Vatican Council was trying to realize in the church. So it was kind of one of the best realizations of things. So Patty's pointing me to my next topic, which is to say a little bit of St. Augustine, because as young Bob Prevost goes to study in the college seminary, he studies with the Augustinians, and he's very much inspired by St. Augustine. So I just wanted to say a couple things about that. St. Augustine is really, the great father of the Western Church. And he has a couple of books that people have probably heard of. The famous Confessions of St. Augustine is one of the classics of Western literature. And it's really kind of an autobiographical work of how he had been a bright guy, studied, learned to become a great intellectual, and liked women and liked sex. And it came to be impressed by all these Christian saints and came to see that Christianity was true. But he had a famous prayer like, "Lord, make me chaste, but not yet." He thought so he very, very fascinating guy. So people with like a hungry heart, as they say, with an emotional life, who've gone through the drama of friendship and love and sex and war and fighting and all that. Like, he goes through all those struggles in the Confession. So that's a famous book that everybody would do well. If many have probably read that. But then he has another famous work, The City of God, and The City of God is kind of a historical story of two cities. This what he calls the city of those people who are ordering their lives towards love of God and love of neighbor, which coexists in the world with the city of people who are loving all kinds of other things, less than God and less than neighbor. And it's a very fascinating treatment he gives, because he, like, just one of the insights, with many insights in City of God, for example, he explains like the fallen city. He says it's characterized by the libido dominandi, the lust to dominate. And he says this is what shows up any place where like fallen humanity is dominating. So you want to dominate sexually, you want to dominate and drink all the whatever, or you want to dominate in business, or you want to conquer the world and kill everybody. So he explains that as the lust to dominate. It's really a profound insight. So a couple more things about St. Augustine. He wrote a very simple rule for living together in community life. The rule of St. Augustine, it's only like 6 pages, and there's just a few key points. He makes very clear in the beginning, this is all about coming together to learn how to love God and love our neighbors, live in charity, live in friendship. So it's very, very very simple. And this is something that like Pope Leo would like have pretty much memorized, the 6 pages. And it's all about what we're about is living in charity, living in friendship. And part of that is prayer. It's rooted in prayer, and especially like liturgical prayer, like pray what they call the liturgy of the hours, and singing that together, morning prayer, evening prayer, night prayer. And then the rule of St. Augustine has other things like you have to learn to moderate your desires, for everything, and then like things like fraternal correction, like how do we correct our neighbors when they're sinning against us, when they're harming them, and how do you do that in a way that's loving and that is conducive to building a life of friendship. So this is like what's in his bones, is trying to live this rule of St. Augustine. And
famous phrase on being a bishop.
Oh yes, and so like what comes out of that, then you might have heard this from him. So what he says when being appointed a bishop, he says, "I'm a Christian with you. I'm a bishop for you." So it's service. It's not about libido dominandi. It's not about being a priest or a bishop. It's not about dominating. It's about serving. So it's a really great foundation, for his formation. But Patty's going to continue on.
And then the last sentence is the motto of the Pope: "Be one in Christ."
Remind me that I'm skipping my mind.
The Holy Father, he chooses a seal, and then the emphasis: "We are one in the one." It's sort of a riddle in Latin. If you look at the Latin below his seal, and that comes from Augustine. You want to elaborate on that? So you don't remember the line. We are one. In other words, He's going to emphasize unity, and the foundation of the unity among us and us with all of humanity is centered in Christ. We are one because of the one capitalized, i.e. Christ.
Okay, so Patty's going to pick up on his formation then. So when he's going into the Augustinians, what kind of formation does he get to make him who he is?
So he's a nerd. Very early on in the boarding school, they realized he's excellent. But what I was struck is all of us by now have realized he must be an introvert, or rather reserved individual. But he very early on had clear signs of being a leader, because besides getting a lot of commendation for academic excellence, he appeared always in the honor roll. He was the editor-in-chief of the yearbook. He was the secretary of the student council, and he was a member of the National Honor Society. He was the captain of the bowling team, and he headed the speech and debate team. So I thought, not bad for an introvert, but you can tell he's a nerd. So he finishes in high school. So pay attention, because that means since he left his home in Chicago, he seldom comes back. He briefly comes back, and then he's told, after you finish high school, now you're going to enroll for your undergraduate in the university that the Augustinians have, which is Villanova, in Philadelphia. And there he's going to major in science, specializing in math. But interesting enough, he chooses elective courses that have nothing to do with science or math, because on his own, he wants to learn Hebrew and Latin. From the get-go, he was very intrigued about, I want to study Augustine, and read him in the original, in Latin. And he very much was immersed. This is now the 70s. He's very much immersed in discussions with his classmates. You have to envision, classmate means not just the Villanova crowd, but the future Augustinian priests who are there to get a degree. And Bill also pointed out to me that this is 3 years after Roe versus Wade, and he starts the first pro-life group on campus, because it's just, they're 3 years into the new law. He finishes, and on the side, you were telling me he liked to very much help in some sort of rehab place and taking care of people
he was
who
involved
have
in recovery
for alcoholics. And then on the side, he may have wanted to do money, so make money, and he worked in a cemetery in Philadelphia. At the same time, he was studying and getting, good grades. So he returned.
Let me interject one more thing. That I don't know if you passed it, but I don't want to steal your thunder. But there was a lot of there was a lot of debates about things going on, like women's ordination, all kinds of sexual ethics issues, and a lot of people got very exercised about them, and people weren't really sure what he thought about these things. He was what they described there is that people would say, we don't really know where he stood on all the debates that were going on. He basically wanted to serve the poor, help the guys in recovery, and go to the soup kitchen or something like that and study. So it's very interesting. In
other words, he shied away from polemics. That's not his style. So he comes back, and then after his bachelor's in science and math, he comes back to Chicago to finish the theology studies in order to become ordained. And he goes to Catholic Theological Union. So that's probably a relief for the parents, because he's in town to finish in 3 years his theological studies. So he, at least if the family was very united and really hurt that he was most of the time away. And then it gets a little more challenging, because while he was studying theology, he also gets involved in helping out teaching in schools. So he's going to be teaching physics and math during his studies. And obviously by now the Augustinians have figured out he's very smart. So they send him to Rome to get his licentiate in canon law. He comes back to Chicago, and during this period, of course, he is learning Italian while he is abroad. And obviously later on, they send him back to Rome to finish a dissertation. So he's a doctor in canon law. And, he's ordained at this time in Rome in 1982. So remember, this is at the height of John Paul II. And then comes his move to, he's 1 year back in Chicago as priest, but they send him out to Peru. So the Peruvian background starts very early. He's sent as a missionary to Peru after his ordination. So let's say he was ordained in 82, comes to Chicago, and by 84, he is in 84, 85, he is in Peru. So the three places it's going to be, I have to read one because it's a convoluted name. Chulucanas is the first one. Then Trujillo, there he is in the seminary teaching. First, he was just a missionary and a priest. Second, he became professor of canon law. And essentially, they use him for whatever they could. And then finally, he comes to Chiclayo, where he later on becomes the bishop. So the interesting thing of this period in Peru is going to be the turmoil, political turmoil. So he's dealing as a priest with the dictatorship, for lack of a better term, there is two, the dictatorship of the military on the right and the Sendero Luminoso, or Shining Path, as they called the communist guerrillas. So both of them, were causing trouble. The military wanted to recruit seminarians, and he stood up. There's a beautiful anecdote of him standing up and saying, "You're not going to take them."
They were in a little minivan, and he had guys he was taking to the seminary, and the military people came on board and they said, "We're taking these guys to join the army." And he basically said, "No, you're not. They're going to become priests." And he said, and the law, they basically knew the law, and he basically quoted the law to them and said, "No, it's against the law to do what you're trying to do, so we're going to go."
And some of the seminarians back then, who were now priests, told the story of what he did and stood out to the military. And then, of course, he had to protect some from the guerrillas who were going to kill nuns and priests. Mm-hmm. So, those are kind of the sketchy parts of his life in Peru. What was most characteristic of Peru, and this is why I take a little bit of a detour, is the church in Peru. But in general, I'm going to give you a very brief description of the nature of the church in Latin America. It's very different from the United States. So my people arrived. So you probably know all the bad stories of, how we went for the mines and the gold, et cetera, et cetera. But the nice story, obviously, is the colonizing and the evangelization of Latin America. So from the get-go, they solved the problem of slavery. In other words, you cannot have slaves. The natives are going to be citizens of the crown or subjects of the crowns. But the minute you're a subject of the crown, you are a citizen. So obviously, they cannot be enslaved. Second, the evangelizers, primarily first Jesuit, they arrived this is 1492, by 1540, the Jesuits arrived. And very soon they understood, we cannot teach these poor people Spanish and then the catechism. So they took it upon themselves, most of the missionaries, to learn many dialects.
Yep.
And they had schools to translate the Gospels, to be able, so they took it upon themselves. It's already difficult enough to move them from the pagan religion to the Christian religion. Let's facilitate by us learning. So this is one of the beautiful things you're going to see in the movie, The Mission. That's the best movie that summarized enculturation, how they mingle with the people and they live with the people. And they're smart enough to understand, for example, to worship the sun. Well, sure enough, there they are, the Spaniards having the monstrance. If you look at the monstrance, they put the Eucharist in the middle, but they go around with somebody that looks like a sun. So that you see creativity also between the symbols and the piety. And then the other characteristic that it's very different from the U.S. is, first of all, the Spaniards were 300 years. That's a long time, much longer than the British here. And they mingle immediately. There's a mestizo culture by which the whites start marrying smart colonial powers, the princes of the Incas. And so they go right away to the hierarchy of the natives and start marrying the native women of social standing. So more and more they're integrated, and we call that the mestizo culture, meaning there's going to be a mixing of the races and of the colors of people. And then the other interesting thing that differs us from in the U.S. from them is they were never exposed to the Protestant Reformation. So we had to hunker down in Europe because we had to defend the church from the new reformers. And therefore, the nature of the Catholic Church in the United States is the minority that comes to a Protestant country. So we always had this more defensive mechanism by which we are the poor, the minority and be feel belligerent, if not as the Irish, by the British. That didn't happen. In Spain, just continued being a feudal church by which the king runs the church, but the church runs the society. So the kings, all the way into the revolutions of the early 1900s, choose the bishops, but the church is in charge essentially of basic infrastructure of society. So they're very involved. There's no separation of church and state. So therefore, they run schools, they run hospitals, they run courts, and that they're immersed in the fabric. So the natives very often thought, oh, the church is our protector. We're not just in front of the civil authorities, but the church is part of the civil regimen. So it's a hybrid that we never had in the United States because we right away had the First Amendment and the non-establishment of church. We're talking about a very established church and a church very much as a civil servant, okay, which is very different. So that leads later on to conflicts because here comes the decolonizing. So essentially, let's get rid of the king. And of course, the higher clergy identifies with the monarchists. And therefore, the new Republicans don't like the established church. But part of the revolutionaries are the so-called Creoles lower church, the people that came from the mixing. So they feel Mexicans by now, or Peruvians. And the clergy itself, the lower church that are not the bishops and the cardinals, is part of the separation from Spain. And there are ups and downs because, of course, they're anti-clerical. They don't want the church to be involved in all these societal things. So there's a back and forth. There's threats of taking away the properties of the church, et cetera, et cetera. And the church retreats from their responsibilities, more dedicated to education and devotions. But again, here comes Leo XIII, who, by the way, inspires the name of Leo XIV. And he says, well, there are problems in society. There are problems with the Industrial Revolution. We need the church involved on matters that affect the working class. Well, that inspires the church to come back in the reign in Latin America. And that's the precursor of what later on will become liberation theology, meaning the church is already aware of social injustices and the clergy is going to get involved. And then you add to that, I'm giving you everything at once, between the 19th and the 20th century, add to that the instability of democracies in Latin America. Because, you have, the communists arriving, you have right-wing dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and add to that the Soviet Union and the United States. So it's all in upheaval. So the church is considered the stable presence. But obviously, there is the influence of Marxist ideas into some strands of liberation theology. To make a long story short, if you want to know more about it, the church under John Paul II issues two documents, more or less written by Joseph Ratzinger in the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith. The first one is a criticism of liberation theology for adopting Marxism. But the second is praising some themes, saying we have to Christianize those themes. But you can see gradually the church adopting the language of preferential option for the poor. It just said clergy cannot get involved directly as politicians, and clergy can never justify, for the sake of revolution and the emancipation and the liberation of those oppressed, use violence. Those were the big no's. But, the other final thing I want to say, because I'm talking too much, is to help a little bit us in North America to understand this big word that people were puzzled about during Francis, synodality. Just be aware that synodality in the Latin American church was exercised since 1958. Because in 1958, under Pius XII, he said, okay, the continent has essentially two languages. So it's unified by faith and it's unified by language. Let's have a pastoral program for evangelizing, because by now they notice secularity. So since the 50s, let's get together more or less every 10 years. All the bishops' conferences, it's 58 before the council, all the bishop conferences get together with laity and catechists because there's a shortage of priests. The continent is huge. So the ladies from the get-go very much in the forefront of being the catechist. The priest may show up once a month for the sacraments. So the laity is very much part of the fabric of formation for the church. So the synods, every 10 years, since 58, I think I have a list here that the list of the synods are essentially from 58 to 2009. There are 5 of them. And the last one is Aparecida. And just to be brief, Aparecida is the one where the main redactor is the Cardinal of Buenos Aires, who is later on Pope Francis. So what he does in Rome is all his experience. In the document Aparecida, you see missionary discipleship, you see the language of accompaniment, which in Spanish is a normal language. In English, it sounded like, where did that word come from? So it's all part of the tradition of Latin America that he will introduce to the universal church through his first document that's called Evangelii Gaudium. And that's why in the middle of being a bishop for 12 years in Peru, Leo XIV, as Bishop Prevost, is participating in those meetings. So for him, it's normal to speak again of synodality because he carries that as the tradition of, he may be born in Chicago, sorry for some of my Chicago friends, but pastorally, he is a Latin American priest, bishop, and then later on cardinal. Sorry, I took too much time. I hope it was not like a fire hose, but you get the gist of it.
Patty teaches a course on Latin American theology, and so
it was not
to help seminarians understand where Pope Francis was coming from, and now where Pope Leo is coming from. So I knew that she had a lot to say about that topic. So
this is the last section. Don't worry. Let's finish.
Yeah, we'll finish up in about 15 minutes. But let me just show a few more. As he becomes bishop, he becomes bishop in 2014. There's actually the
name Leo in Spanish is Lion. So that's how they're calling him now. His people in Peru, the Lion of Peru. Because Leo is translated from Latin to Spanish as lion. So he's the Lion of Peru.
For people who stay after, there's a little video here. It's like a 2-minute video that the Vatican puts out where they it's a YouTube video.
It's 2 minutes. Go ahead. It's a great. I mean,
well, we're not sure if we know how to do it, so it might save it for afterwards.
Just for a change of pace, so that
why don't we keep going? So we might come back to that later. So the second section, what we wanted to talk about is so this Pope Leo, what challenges does he face now? And I wanted to talk about that in terms very briefly from 3 different perspectives. There are different views on what the challenges are facing the church and facing the new Holy Father. If you look at it from the perspective of the Vatican, the challenges really have to do with really receiving the Second Vatican Council, which would have the church really be a force that infuses the world with the spirit of the gospel. And we never really figured out how to do that. Like even as well as it had been done in Chicago before the council, we really got off track there. And so Pope John Paul II, before him, John XXIII, Paul VI, all the popes have been focused on trying on the Second Vatican Council and the kind of reforms that would help the church to really bring salt and light to the world. And so that was the emphasis for John Paul II, for Benedict XVI, for Francis, and the Vatican continues. Pope Leo really is going to see things the same way. So that's one way of looking at things in the world. If you come to the United States, a more conservative reading of like what is needed for the new pope, they would emphasize they want clarity about teachings that they thought were not clear enough for Francis, about sexual ethics, about marriage, about who can come to communion, about abortion and where that fits. And so you have some people will say that what Leo needs to do is he needs to be clear about those topics, and then we won't be as critical of the Pope as we had been with Francis. So that's one perspective. And then there's other people in the American church who would say things like, well, there's obviously a big financial crisis, and the Vatican's very short on money right now because of different reasons. And so some people say,
call it by its name. Well, go ahead. Never mind. Yeah.
But so anyway, so there's other views, but I would say I think the view that we really need to receive the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and which includes living out Catholic social doctrine. So that's another perspective in the United States that would align more with what Leo would say. So what the challenges are facing the church depends on different perspective, a perspective coming from the Vatican. And another thing that the Vatican would see very much, they really see something they call the polycrisis, a crisis involving an environmental crisis, an economic crisis, a political crisis that's really kind of bringing big threat to the human family right now. So that's one of the ways that like a Vatican perspective would really focus on what the priorities are. And so what emphases has Leo indicated in his initial weeks as Pope? Well, he's basically emphasized that he wants to continue in the general trajectory of Pope Francis and the previous popes. He wants to emphasize the Second Vatican Council. He picked the name Leo, which is a signal that when a pope picks the name, that usually signals an affinity with the previous person who had that name. And so Leo XIII was the one who really began modern Catholic social teaching and tried to give the church direction and how to respond to the disruption from the Industrial Revolution. And so that was seen as a big signal, and he has talked in multiple multiple venues about that. He's very concerned about peace. He's concerned about justice. He's concerned about those things. He mentioned the challenges that artificial intelligence and technology are bringing to the world. So and then with Pope Francis, this idea of synodality, which this odd sounding word, but basically from Greek, the syn just means with, and then hodos is road, and it's an allusion to the disciples on the road to Emmaus, kind of walking together and talking with Jesus. So what it simply means is that it emphasizes a church of disciples, walking the path of discipleship with Jesus, and it's contrasted really with an idea that, well, there's clergy, they're the boss, and they tell us what to do, and we just come to Mass on Sunday or something like that. Now, the idea is, synodality is that the church is a community of disciples following Jesus and trying to bring the gospel to the world. So those are his kind of priorities. And the question of, like what people might hope, their hopes really come from their view of what the problems are facing the church and their view of the church and those kind of things. So now we have plenty of time for any questions or discussion about.
Is the video ready?
Yeah.
Here we go. Just finish the video. That's a good ending.
Ya tenemos papa y es peruano y de Chiclayo. ¿Es peruano y es de Chiclayo?
Habemus papam.
Es como cuando mi equipo mete gol, una alegría.
Robertum Franciscum, Sancte Romane Ecclesiae, Cardinalem Prevost.
Y se me permiten también una palabra, un saludo a mi querida diócesis de Chiclayo en el Perú.
No lo podíamos creer, el padre Roberto, decíamos, pero si lo he visto por aquí caminando.
Y me dejó su cámara. que es antigüita, pesada, pero buena.
Nuestra región fue fuertemente golpeada por la pandemia y fue allí que nuestro Papa León XIV puso de pie a la iglesia para hacer una campaña Oxígeno de la Esperanza.
El Papa León vino con botas, se metió por esa callecita que está ahí, estaba todo inundada, nadie podía entrar.
Que donde haya guerra, Él va a poner paz. Donde haya discordia, Él va a poner amor.
Tengo aquí su Santa Rita. Esta es su Santa Rita, Papa León XIV.
Yo soy Robert, pero dígame Roberto, ¿no? Dígame Roberto.
Y aquí tenemos un joven Robert Prevost caminando por las calles de Trujillo.
Thanks.
So that's who he is. We're just getting to know him, trying to learn about him, and so we happy to try to answer any questions anyone might have. Hey,
Well, the similarities in the background between Pope Francis and Pope Leo XIV, we're going to let you sort about the mission of America. And Pope Francis brings him to Rome, names him a cardinal 2 years later. Oh, would that suggest that he was Francis and next successor, or am I reading too much into that?
all right.
Well, hold on a second. They didn't get along.
Initials. Oh, no,
Well, there's a famous anecdote when Pope Francis in 2013, Cardinal Bergoglio, whom he knew as cardinal because of the big meetings of Ceylon, when he became Pope, Prevost jokingly said to his brother Augustinians, he was just Father Prevost, he says, "Oh, great, I'll never be a bishop," because he and I had some disagreements. So he was relieved. And, this is 2013. What happened? Well, in the meantime, this is a big difference with Francis. Francis was parachuted from Argentina. Prevost had been 12 years in Rome as the head of the whole order. So he lived a half a mile from the Curia and the Vatican. So he had interactions he was there since 01. So he has been there from 01 to 2013. So he was in Rome living under Pope John Paul II, Benedict XVI, and then, he essentially is a priest running the order, and Pope Francis gets elected, and to his surprise, he is made a bishop a year later. But he was not expecting, but sure enough, he left Rome to go back to Peru. So,
but the short answer to your question, Dave, is he was very much favored. Francis basically said, "This is the best guy for the church," and he tried to put him in positions that would make him very well known. He put him in charge of the dicastery for bishops, and so that basically makes you meet with all the bishops from each country and be involved in the deliberations about who's going to be made a bishop. And so
he looked upon the choice of Boston and Providence because as this probably was in the making already like 3 or 4 months. So Prevost knew who was coming to Rhode Island or who was coming to Boston. And as the head of the Order of the Augustinians, he had been traveling all around the world. So he had much more administrative knowledge, which the cardinals appreciate. And he knew all different countries from traveling to visit the Augustinians. So he had met all the bishops from all those places. So he had qualifications, but he's very quiet. He never, during those meetings that they had before the conclave, he never really picked up the microphone and started saying, "Oh, this is my plan," or nothing. He just was very quiet and just met with the people in a just, normal, quiet way. So I think we don't know what Francis was thinking. He was not a shiny star. Nobody was betting on him. But as a human being, he struck a lot of people as having a rare combination of extremely smart, very quiet. He speaks only when he needs to, and he is incredibly practical. So if he sees a problem, he seems to be very clear into not taking factions, but listening very carefully to everybody. And then they said he may listen carefully to everybody, but he's no pushover once he decides, which is good to have that backbone in the Vatican because you're going to get people talking from all sides.
Any other questions? Gary.
I would say, it's a young pope, and so if you were just taking a guess, like, what do you think, say, 20 years from now, what did the church look like? We'd see our increase again, women priest.
No, women priest is not with him. No. He's a canon lawyer. He's a man of the books with the biggest rules in the church and the less flexible. I'm not thinking he's going to be by the book, but his mind is very trained and organized.
And where he's practical.
He wants to bring unity. I don't think he wants to be exotic. There's too many problems, starting with the finance. But anyway, my husband has a different view.
Well, I think that he'll be very deliberate and very shrewd. I think there's some openings, for example, for him to do some things that are unifying. He tries to be a bridge builder. That's, so one of his nicknames is Bobby the Bridge Builder. And so, like, for example, like in the United States, some of the more conservative people are really upset that Francis restricted the traditional Latin Mass. And, and so I've always thought that there was an easy way to satisfy people's desires for Latin in the liturgy, which is to use the Novus Ordo liturgy of Vatican II and to just use more Latin responses. And like in a parish, you could just have one Mass where you do Novus Ordo chanted in Latin. Like if you have 4 or 5 Masses on a weekend, you could have a very nice Novus Ordo chanted in Latin, and there's a very nice
for the people who want to be more into the traditional, have a room carved for them inside the parish so that they don't feel like they're being alienated.
There's a real treasury of beautiful sacred polyphony music for people like Palestrina. And like, so for people who like that, if you just made that kind of a liturgy, one of the 4 or 5 liturgies at a parish available every weekend, I don't think people would really want to go to the Tridentine rite. The Novus Ordo is a much cleaner Mass. I think people would like it better. So there's an opportunity there where he could really be a bridge builder and, just encourage people to make that available at many parishes once a week. And all the people who are going to the Trident, I think you'd bring a lot of the people
and
back.
Other topics that he could be a bridge builder with?
Well, I think something like the Second Vatican reception of the Second Vatican Council. We really have not. We've given up on trying to give people basic catechesis on what the Second Vatican Council was about. You haven't seen that in years, and so there could be some good education on that. Something like there's other things, but I think he will. I think he will be very deliberate, and he'll find ways to try to build bridges. And I don't think he'll try to step on any landmines. He won't. He doesn't want to cause division.
I mean, it's not his style because when he was in Chiclayo, the 2 bishops prior to him were associated with Opus Dei, which is a very big organization in Latin America, which, for lack of a better term, is considered conservative. So when he arrived, most of the priests didn't want him. First of all, he's an American, but in the meantime, he was perfect in Spanish. But he took it upon himself to reach out to them. And by the end of his tenure, he didn't like to have the faction of the ones who like me and the ones who are, nostalgic of the previous, more conservative bishops. He essentially reached out to them and tried to manage to essentially work with all of them. And he succeeded because after 10 years, you can see all those priests who didn't want him there saying he was great. He listened to us, he understood our reservations, and he always was open to our suggestions. And to the other side, he said, let's stop with this hostility of considering the other priests not on my team. That's where the unity that Augustine always emphasized came into play. And he was very much appreciated as a bishop.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, I'm not a slow person and stuff, but like, there's obviously some things that like you can't really like work in that with. You can't really like build the bridges together, like with the German church and with like, on the view is that kind of for instance, by allowing the blessings of the same-sex couples kind of open the door of the German church to go where it's going. So I was wondering what you guys thought, if there's any indication about whether you would support that same-sex blessing, that you would like modify the language of it. He would give some sort of ultimatum to the German church.
Can I answer?
As far as I know, was
Can I clarify?
Patty really wants to answer this question, so go ahead.
Chronology is important. Chronology, no internet entries. Chronology. The Germans started thinking about these things in 73. They were very on the avant-garde. So it comes now that with the internet, everything is focusing what they have been doing the last 5 years, but this comes from earlier. Second, and they brought up already the question of homosexuals. Second, a clarifying note, the Vatican, after they announced what they were doing, they clarified it's not a blessing of the couple. The priest is, first of all, when you're at Mass and you attend Mass, you get already that blessing. So it was already happening. It's just that they come individually, and they may be together, but they're going to get individually a blessing as individuals, not because they're partners. Of course, then you have the noise of the internet, the headlines of the secular media. This is the beginning of gay marriage approval, et cetera, none of that. But the problem of the Vatican, it didn't communicate that clearly enough. So it led to that. So I don't think Leo is going to start with those polemic. And by the way, the Vatican was twice harshly corrected by Rome. They sent twice a letter saying, you don't do this. There's not such a thing as an independent synodal church without Rome. But again, you can, how do you say in English, bring the horse to the water? But, what's going to happen probably is he's going to just let the leaders who are cardinals and so on essentially die out and, new leadership. He is in charge of promoting new bishops. So be patient, stay tuned. But I don't think that's a very particular problem of a particular church. That doesn't necessarily, have anything to do with big problems that the Southern Hemisphere has, because that's where the biggest amount of Catholics are. The church in Europe and the United States is not anymore the majority. It's Africa, particularly, and Asia.
Let me add something. So as somebody who's worked in moral theology for a long time, I always thought that there are also ways to deal with disputes about moral questions that come up kind of in the culture war discussion, about abortion and same-sex relations and these kind of things. And if you go back to the Second Vatican Council, there's actually an emphasis there that can help. When the Second Vatican Council, it said just a very little bit about like what should be done with moral theology, to renew moral theology with the council, which is trying to come to grips with the modern world. And it basically emphasized that you ground people more deeply in Scripture, point them to their high calling in Christ, to holiness, and their obligation to bear the fruit of charity for the life of the world. That's the emphasis of the Council Fathers on what we should emphasize in Christian morality. And we've done, like in my view, most of the debates about moral matters have, there was a different emphasis. You had an earlier tradition in the church where we tried to, the church took a paternalistic approach where we tried to align with states and basically say, look, we have this, this very demanding moral teaching about holiness and covering sexual ethics and marriage and all these things. And we're going to, and a lot of people struggle trying to live that. And so an old approach was basically to say, we'll line up with the state and we'll try to coerce people into following the fullness of the moral law as we understand it. And that, the church abandoned that paternalistic approach. The Second Vatican Council tried to abandon that paternalistic approach. And so you can basically, still keep high standards of morality, but you can basically encourage people to say, try encounter Christ, pursue the life of holiness, and live the life of charity in the world. You can give that emphasis, and you don't have to, and you can still say we still have we still try to be faithful to the moral truth and what's a life of holiness, and so you don't have to back away from any of that, but you can say everybody try to find your holiness in Christ, live out that life of holiness, and live out the life of charity in the world. That's the emphasis of the Second Vatican Council. And so Leo could return to that emphasis, make that emphasis clear, and say, no, we shouldn't be trying to like find a government that'll impose, a very strict morality on everybody. We actually tried that in, with fascist states in between the wars, and it didn't work very well. So there's lots of areas where a wise and smart person could bring the church together and help it to receive the council, so that the church can be what the council called the church to be, an instrument of reconciliation in the world. Like the beginning of the document on the church, it talks about the church as the kind of like a sacrament of unity in the world. And that by living out the Christian life in the world, you infuse the world with the spirit of the gospel, with the spirit of truth and justice and respect for human dignity. So he can very much point us in those directions, which will be very unifying. You should be able to make most of the people in Germany happy and people in other places happy with that approach.
But to be more specific about, that's essentially the Catholic theology in the big picture. In the small picture, and I think here Francis was a little bit misunderstood, to welcome people with same-sex attraction doesn't mean you're denying that the church considers their lifestyle very problematic, okay? But the point of departure is not looking at the person simply as a sinner and define the person, well, you have a problem because of your sexual orientation. The point of departure is that person is a child of God too. So the point of departure is, regardless of how people are broken or addicted to this or that, or having, a very sinful lifestyle, God still has love for them. God still, regardless of the sin. So the point of departure is they deserve everybody's respect because they have the same dignity as a human being, regardless of how you behave. So the question is then, okay, so how do you evangelize that? And in this contemporary culture, you cannot, it's not very effective to go frontal with the judgment, saying, hey, you're a sinner, you're a mortal sin, you're going to hell. Well, that's the end of the conversation, because evangelization is not a matter of imposing a persuasion, but how do I try to help this person with charity to realize, well, not right away go to the rule and say, well, the church doesn't like how you live. Well, why? Because the person is going to say, well, this is how I experience love. So you're going very personal. I think that's what Pope Francis kept saying, accompaniment, which in English sounds odd, which is get to know this person, get to know this gay individual, get to know this lady who may be a prostitute. Who knows? Any of us can think of themselves having a weakness. And gain their trust. Let them know, I love you first as a person. I'm not going right away into, who are you partnering with? No. And then slowly, when they know that you care for them, that you love them, they can start trusting you. And when there's trust, there is the openness to say, okay, let me be sincere. You may be having these struggles or you may be having this problem because this is how the church thinks of love. And then you start opening up for a different perspective. You always will have to respect their freedom. They may not change their lifestyle. They may not be, chaste with their partner, but at least you keep that door open. So Pope Francis didn't mean to say, oh, let's change the rules and be so nice to everybody that we don't care about the lifestyle. No, for him, it's a question of method. How do we go about approaching these people? And we'll lose them if we go right away with the young people. Hey, you, whatever you call it now, the hookup culture. I mean, of course, everybody's going to hell. But, okay, why are you in need of so much sex? Do you really find yourself having true relationship where you right away just sleep with anybody? But till you get to those questions to make them think and maybe change their ways. And by the way, we don't change anybody's ways because we are, persuasive. It's God's grace. And you bring them closer to God with your kindness and your charity. Right away going into the judgment, I don't think it's a conversation starter. I don't know if that helps.
All right. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm preaching. Yeah.
So, when you're speaking about Pope from Leo's charisma and his insight, how does it feel for you? You seem like you're a hybrid in a certain sense because you bring the best of the church and the teaching, but you're also in the world in a way different than Leo. So how do you feel as a bridge builder? How's it going?
Oh, yeah.
Well, let me see if I understand your question. So, as a lay person in the world, you're asking how do I see trying to build bridges in the world as a Catholic? Do I see that as hard, or is that?
You're doing what people are asking Leo to do, because I see you bringing the wisdom of the church.
Yeah,
and knowing that the social justice has to be addressed.
Right.
So in a sense,
so how do I find that message selling in the world, or
how's it working for you? How are you bringing back that vibrancy to Chicago?
Yeah. I think it's a challenge. I think that the potential for that to really bear fruit is really depends on God's grace. It's Augustine, the doctor of grace, would say it really depends on God's grace. And I would say that the way things have developed, and I'm not sure if this is getting to your question, but like the way our culture is right now, it's very hard for people to really receive, or it has been hard for people to receive a real Catholic vision of social things. But I think there's a very good message to tell, and we don't do a very good job of communicating that. And so, that sometimes things can change so that people become more receptive to what people might have been trying to tell them. And so I think, like, if you look at, I try to very much pay attention to the way the church is thinking. Like, I think that's one of like an essential guide to doing theology, is to try to get in touch with the same spirit who, has inspired the scriptures and is present in Christ and guides the magisterium. I think that's like a neglected thing. So I think I trust God, and I have hope for the future. And I think that the church has a great word for everybody, even though we've ignored it. And so I trust in God's power to make people receptive to that message. And we'll have to see if people can kind of wake up to that. I think there's a great message to tell. I'm trying to build networks of people that I converse with, and I think the church has a great message, and I think Leo is. I couldn't be more happy and hopeful that the church has, a man like Leo to lead us. And
his style is going to be more palatable.
I think I think it's an exciting time for the church, for people to try to learn from our Pope and be part of the solution. I think that if the church wakes up and follows the Holy Father that we've been given, that'll be, that's the hope for the world. This is the Jubilee year of hope. And the Vatican, if you look at the way the Vatican introduced the Jubilee year of hope, it basically says we have this polycrisis, which is an existential crisis for the world. And it basically, we're calling for a year of hope. And so I think that, so anyway, that's how I don't know if that touches on your question.
And speaking of learning of Leo, don't wait for headlines or off the cuff whenever the media goes crazy about a headline. That he's not going to fit much into that. And you may miss how you can learn of him. And I highly recommend, it's a small thing to do, but if you get into the habit, he doesn't speak long. So whenever he gives speeches, if you notice, it's essentially between 8 minutes and 12 minutes, never longer, because I've been watching him. And I would highly recommend every Wednesday to check into the Vatican webpage to either listen or read. And you have to move the video because it's the audience. And right now, he picked up from Francis the theme of the parables. So every single Wednesday, he talks to you about what he understands from the parable. And he's beautiful because he mainly talks about what God is doing and what Jesus is saying. And, you know, he doesn't go right away into, hey, telling you what to do. But at the end, after the 8-minute reflection, he spends 2 or 3. He turns to you and says, dear sisters and brothers, based on what Jesus was telling us through this parable, this is how we are going to be challenged. And he gives you some tidbits, but you can see there how he wants you to have, like Augustine, a very robust interior life, and how to personalize the scriptures for you, because at the end, he gives you guidelines and he includes himself. This is a challenge for me because of this and this and that. But every Wednesday, go into the Vatican webpage and read essentially one page, and he's building up. And every single week with the parables, he gives you a consistent, beautiful message. The media will never tell you because it's not a big encyclical or a big line that you take out on encyclical or a throw, you know, an exotic soundbite in a flight from who knows where. He's incredibly discreet, but this one, you can see it's something he has prepared and read. And you can start getting to know his style. He's very gentle, but incredibly spiritually profound because, you know, nothing erudite or nothing, but it's beautiful how he accompanies you in reading the scriptures. And I would recommend that for every Wednesday.
I felt the Latin American context that you gave very enlightening. And I think, as you articulated, Pope Francis, the people of accompaniment, time where that stemmed from. I think also too, it's clear that the Jesuit influence of Pope Francis, this evangelization approach to with the Jesuits trying to get on the edge of the world, the edge of society, to exist there in the full as a distinct nature. I'm curious what you might know about the Augustinian approach to evangelization, and if you maybe could strengthen it all on
charity and unity.
I think it's very much about friendship and living charity. There's an intellectual component to an Augustinian approach. I mean, there's a profound kind of intellectual tradition with Augustine. So I think the essence of it would be friendship. But it's also very biblical. Not ready to preach the word when the time comes. But I think the model of friendship and
here's how they complement each other. He's going to be, because of friendship, the emphasis of the Augustinian is much more communal than the Jesuits. The Jesuits are, for lack of a better metaphor, the Marines. Okay, they go in the forefront alone, because that's why they put so much emphasis in discernment. The Jesuits is an individual. They even don't pray together. They have to be trained to go to Russia alone, to go to Japan alone, and survive even without a community. So that's why they're more militaristic, meaning they have the strict obedience. I'm sent there. I'm by myself. I'm staying the course. And they don't have communal prayer life. They are ready to be the Marines alone in missionary areas where nobody is. I mean, right now they could be hiding somewhere in Russia. You will never know. But the Augustinians never had that approach. It's from the get-go, because if you read the Confessions, the way Augustine talks about how in part he sees the presence of Christ in his life through people without him acknowledging, because he's still not converted. But then he reflects upon, oh, that's what my mother, Monica, was so worried about. Oh, that's why. And the apex is, he's a little snob. So he says, well, scriptures are written in such poor Latin. He's a rhetorician, so he likes fancy Latin. And a bunch of thugs wrote the scriptures, so to speak, not refined people. And instead, he gets to the friendship with the Cardinal of Milan, Ambrose, who is a fantastic preacher. And he gets mesmerized, like, oh, there is an intellectual Christian who is opening, the scriptures for me, and it gets personal for him. So for him, the question of the presence of Christ through friendship and through community is going to be more crucial to his life and to his style than Francis. Francis, you can tell, he was not much going to the Jesuit community down the street. What did Pope Leo do? 4 days, the head of his community where he used to live turned 70 or 80, and he went there to celebrate his birthday. And there is a funny anecdote where he tells his friend, who was the superior of the house, do you want to preside the Mass? The Pope humbly said, do you want to have your Mass with you to celebrate? And I can celebrate. And the other guy, absolutely not. The Pope will be presiding the church. But there you see the familiarity. And that's good for him because he will always have close by a sounding board. Francis had just advisors, and you never know if they had the private interest. This guy has his family right there, and he seems not to have a problem going back to them. And they probably can scream at him saying, what were you thinking? So it's a different style because in the church, we don't have Protestant churches splintering every time somebody has a great idea. We have new orders, arising whenever somebody has a new charism.
Let me just interject something that I was hoping we'd put in somewhere. One of the things you see in the whole history of Leo's life is that everybody wants to put him in charge. And he has good relationships with everybody. I mean, you see all the people back in Peru, they all love him. And you look at how they couldn't fit any more signatures on that big board where everybody could say something to him. And you got, this guy's got a camera that he gave to him, and you see the little. So basically, everybody loves him and wants him in charge. That's one of the characteristics of his whole life, is that he's friends with them. They think he's humble. They think he's smart. They think he's holy, and they want him in charge.
It's credibility. He didn't pursue to be in charge, and they kept voting him in because you become the head of the Augustinians by election. And he was elected twice. I don't think you're allowed the third time. So that was the same. But we have talked so long. At the end of the day, I would say, wait and see. We don't know if that was.
Thank you very much.